and long jail terms, but we should at least learn a broader lesson about rule by experts, by the likes of Whitty and Vallance and Professor Pantsdown. Laura Dodsworth is the author of State of Fear, and she just gave a cracking speech at the Cambridge Union on this very subject, speaking for the motion, "This House has had enough of experts." Boris Johnson, I don't know whether you remember him, Laura, but he used to pride himself on being the reincarnation of Winston Churchill. And in fact, Churchill, you quoted Churchill on experts in your speech.
That's true, I did, and thank you very much for saying it was a cracking speech. Unfortunately, I was on the side that suffered a landslide loss because actually it turned out the House has not had enough of experts. Yes, in a letter to H.G. Wells, Winston Churchill warned that the very worst thing we could do is to put unlimited faith into experts. The worst thing would be for government to fall into the hands of experts. Actually, the ignorant, uninformed man knows very well what is good for him through his own objective experience of life. That's to sum up Winston Churchill's quote. I mean, it would be ludicrous to say that we've had enough of all experts, or that experts don't have a place in society. I mean, if my central heating breaks down, I want an expert gas central heating plumber to fix it. If I have to go to the doctor about HRT, I would like a general practitioner and an endocrinologist to see me. They're experts. I think the problem is that so much power was put into the hands of experts. Now, experts deal in facts, and they deal in evidence, but evidence is always socially constructed. It's influenced by political and social bias. And the particular experts that I was concerned with when I wrote A State of Fear, and they're the experts that I concern myself with in the speech at Cambridge Union, are the behavioural scientists, the nudgers, because I think what they do in today's world is very important for people to understand. They nudge us into making what they deem to be the correct decisions, into the correct behaviour. Now, what they did used to look quite innocuous. They would try to work on reducing obesity, or to encourage people to smoke less, or reduce knife crimes. And they've boasted quite brazenly about helping us to lock up the biscuit tins. But what they did over the last couple of years was encourage us to lock ourselves up. And there have been much graver consequences inflicted upon all of society as a result of nudge. And the real problem with nudge, Mark, is that people don't know it's happening. So I would say it's fundamentally anti-democratic.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. But what's interesting to me is that as at the Cambridge Union the other night, there are large numbers of people who are actually quite in an undeferential age where the church and the monarchy and all kinds of institutions don't command deference. This prostration before very narrow expertise is kind of a new phenomenon, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I feel at the moment that democracy is held in some contempt. If we go back to the beginning of lockdown, just staying on that, you know, Parliament had a very short space of time to consider emergency regulations, and then many hundreds of statutory instruments were passed. That's secondary legislation. It was never really given due consideration in Parliament, so that's one sense in which we didn't hold democracy dear enough. Government politicians deferred to the science as though they should be led by science. But the evidence on COVID should have been only one factor that was taken into consideration, because lockdowns, mandates of various sorts, masks, they obviously all have other knock-on effects, which are social, cultural, economic. So I think we probably needed a much broader, multidisciplinary team of experts. But it's not just about the disciplines. And I think this is an important point, because I think if you look at SAGE, if you look at the behavioural scientists, I'm going to make a sweeping generalisation, and they might be cross with me, but I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find people who would define themselves as socially conservative or libertarian or Brexiteer. I think you get quite a homogenous groupthink in these groups. And in fact, for A State of Fear, I interviewed a few experts who had been squeezed out of groups. They were told they were the wild card or they were inconvenient, and they were less relied upon in that expert setting because their views weren't as comfortable. So that's another danger with the reliance upon the experts.
Yeah, the coalition of all the talents is drawn too narrowly. But certain things could have been foreseen. For example, the damage to children by not letting them build their immune systems, by not letting them socially interact with other children. That's entirely obvious, yet apparently these guys did it to us anyway.
Well, that's a very good point. And I think a big part of the problem was that a certain type of expert is relied upon and makes their views known, and other types of experts are ignored or deplatformed or censored. Look at what happened to the Great Barrington Declaration scientists. We had an MP in this country, Neil O'Brien, who was one of the founders of a website which contained a list of scientists and journalists who were deemed guilty of wrongthink. And of course this is dangerous because science should involve a great deal of question, and we need to be really wary of that grandiosity that says science can't be challenged. And in fact, if we'd had vigorous debates about the immune systems of children, as you say, and many other issues, we may have taken different decisions. I mean, think about Fauci. He said that it's dangerous to question science because he represents science. That's a very, very flawed and grandiose premise to take. We should never let that happen again. These are the scientists, the experts that we want to be very, very wary of indeed. But coming back to the nudges, the problem is that many of these policies that would be difficult to foist upon a population become more palatable when our psychology is leveraged. And during the pandemic, we saw fear, shame and social conformity leveraged to the hilt. Now, you might have heard of the Milgram experiment. What it basically found out is that people will kill other people with electric shocks if somebody in a white lab coat tells them to. Normally, this would be a cognitive bias we would think is quite dangerous. You know, it's not a great human trait to encourage, and yet that conformity was leveraged to the hilt. And I think that's quite odd, and that's the psychologists who did that.